Erin tried to swallow her pride as she stalked down the street, feeling fear prick her spine. If she was honest, she knew she should have listened to the commander. She'd never left the ops base whilst on field work before now. Hardly ever seen a damn alien, let alone shot one. Also, deep down inside, she knew that what scared her more than anything was this newfound ability. When she and Ryan had crept into the armory to take the gun, she could never have realized that it would lead to this. Sure, the bolts fit. That wasn't a surprise. Heck, it was why they'd chosen the damn thing in the first place. She'd expected it to fit. Although, maybe not so snugly. So perfectly. She was still growing, not even an adult, and yet it fit. But that was, by the by, clever programming, clever design, unlikely but not impossible. Maybe that was what she had been made to do in the first place. Use a gun that had been illegal for years. Why not? It made no less sense than anything else in her life had. What scared her, although she'd never admit it, not to Ryan and never the commander, was the knowledge. The way that she picked up the gun and already knew what it felt like. The way she clipped it into place. The way she knew every inch of the thing. How to fire it, where to aim, and the delay time. Everything. If it was related to her arm, then heck, she could deal with it. But this was like it was inside her head. She wished Ryan were here, and then told herself that she didn't, because she was a big girl now. Really? If only the gun felt a little heavier, felt as heavy as it really was, then things wouldn't seem so strange. But now, to work. Erin Castoria wasn't turning her back now. Not for Ryan, nor any commander. For no one. She'd been heading for the central plaza of Sebedo City, for the aliens had already claimed it, and many of the surrounding blocks. Of course, that was where the breach had appeared, right in the middle of the busiest city in the system, so she couldn't even get close. But she saw the explosions and thick smoke rising from the struggle within. In residential Block C, Erin pulled up short. Nedrax were piling in from the east, and Erin stood behind a barrier of Wormwood's best, who were slugging as many machine gun bullets as they could. Slowly but surely, though, the aliens were breaking through, climbing over the dead bodies faster than the guns could keep up with. She skipped around the barrier and fired half a dozen shots into the alien mass, killing 2 and injuring a 3rd. There was a commotion from the gunmen behind her, but she tried to ignore them. They were telling her to get out the way or asking what the heck she was firing with. With the giant mechanical contraption attached to her, in a world of exploding buildings and the flying remains of both humans and monsters, the young girl looked more alien than any of the creatures pounding down the street. He lowered his gun. She winked at him in a very disconcerting way. After a few minutes of concentrated fire, things got a lot worse. Another wave of Nedrax smashed straight through the tower block on the west side of the square, and Erin spun to aim at them and left the rest to machine gun fire.
Who even is she?
What the hell is that thing she's got with her?
Doesn't she look like an ops girl?
Erin grit her teeth and fired as fast as she could, watching the fluid capsule go down and down each time that she pumped the complicated trigger mechanism. Still plenty of juice left, wasn't there?
No!
Erin jumped, and a stray shell from her thermistor cannon bounced off target to shatter 3 high-rise windows instead. Amidst all the chaos, the shouts, the guns, and the screams of soldiers and civilians, one cry rang through her ears clearer than any other.
No, no, no!
Erin stopped firing altogether and saw a child, only meters from a new group of rampaging Nedrax that had burst through the barricades. He had been lucky not to have been torn apart by one of her shells, and no doubt that was why he was screaming at her to stop. The tiny figure crouched under the rubble, hands over his head, dead and dying humans and aliens surrounding him. "Stop shooting," Erin breathed to herself, dropping her arm to her side in stunned shock, with her eyes fixed on the child's distress. The gun bounced against her leg, but Erin didn't feel it. The men behind her, blasting their machine guns, hadn't heard the child scream, nothing but background noise to them. but instead began to direct their fire to the aliens only yards behind him.
Stop shooting!
Erin cried, jolting out of her numb shock. She turned to them, horrified.
Stop! Stop! Stop!
None of them paid her any attention, except for the man who had aimed at her earlier. He looked away very uncomfortably, and then glanced just as uneasily at the child, huddled in the center of the square. He pulled the trigger anyway.
There's a civilian! Can't you see?
Erin shouted again, panic settling in.
It's a fucking child! Stop! Oh, hell!
Only a child herself, Erin Castoria ran directly into the path of aliens 3 times her size, with a wall of machine guns behind her that would stop for no man. She heard a bullet smash through the fluid capsule on her gun, but ran on determined, and prayed that luck was on her side tonight. After slipping and falling twice, Erin was almost at the hellish ruins of the house where the blonde boy was curled up, when she felt a bullet rip into the back of her left shoulder. The girl had never been shot before, and it hurt an awful lot more than she had imagined it could. Erin Castoria shouted louder than she ever had, an inarticulate and involuntary cry, and collapsed to the ground in a mess. She tried to curl into a ball and scrunched her face up in pain, smelling blood and dirt. Desperately, she made clawing attempts to reach her damaged shoulder with her hands, as though it would miraculously ease the soothing fire that ran from the wound to her brain. She cautiously managed to open one eye as she squirmed about on the ground, and the machine gun sounded louder than ever. The little boy wasn't shouting anymore. It took several attempts, and more than a few angry grunts of pain, but Erin eventually propped herself up onto her elbows. The child was only meters away, eyes fixed on her, and unable to make another sound. Even though she knew that she couldn't do it, Erin tried to stand up to get to him, but ended up back on the floor in a heap. She gasped at a new flash of pain and leant her forehead against the ground. The aliens were breaking through behind the rubble. The machine guns were never going to stop, and this night was never going to end, and... There was a hesitant poke on her other shoulder, and she dragged her gaze upwards to meet the child's blue eyes. He pulled on her arm urgently, and she tried to haul herself after him, if not to safety, then to out of the firing line. What was only meters seemed suddenly to be a marathon distance, and if it weren't for the insistent tugging of the child, Erin would have burst into helpless tears right there and laid down to die. Eventually, the two of them struggled to the relative safety of a smooth wall, and Erin turned her head around to take note of the situation again, trying to force vomit down with sheer willpower as her head swam in pain. This was as much shelter as they were going to get. With a loud and snarling grunt, Erin threw herself over so that her body was arched protectively about the child, who was staring at her, silent and stunned again. She took one look at the cannon and knew that it was screwed. Whole chunks of metal were shorn right off and sticking out at wrong angles. No matter, it would have run out of power after a few more shots anyway. It had been good while it lasted. She shifted her weight and tried to pry the gun off of her arm with her other hand, but the pain burned through her again and she caught her breath.
I'm gonna be sick.
She hissed as her vision went blotchy. The child hurriedly reached out to offer a hand, and the gesture was enough to bring Erin back. She grit her teeth hard. It took brute force and a lot of grunts, but the thermistor cannon itself eventually came off in about 6 different pieces, unrecognizable. Erin dropped them to the floor and wiped her bloody hands on the front of her trousers, struggling to breathe.